Soon after the 2024 presidential election, I had a bit of an instant reaction video on my channel. But now that time has settled, I wanted to do a bit of a redo and give some more thorough thoughts on what I think we should expect in the next administration when it comes to Amtrak. So here you go. The first thought is that when making such a prediction, we should not just be mindful of what President Trump might want, but what the United States House of Representatives and what the United States Senate might want. While it may be easy to get all consumed by Trump, we should not forget that there is a legislative branch to consider as well. And because of that legislative branch, I don't think we can really predict anything beyond 2026, because that's when the next elections are for the House and the Senate. As anyone familiar with national politics would know, about a third of Senate seats will be up for election 2 years from now, while all House seats will be up for election 2 years from now. What this means is that we only have an idea of how likely the House and the Senate are to support the executive branch's ideas over the next 2 years. Elections in 2026 could completely change the narrative in this regard. If control of either the House or the Senate flips from the Republicans to the Democrats. Or, on the flip side, if the Republicans gain upon their majority in these two legislative chambers. Which begs the following questions. What does Trump desire when it comes to Amtrak? And how likely are the House and the Senate to support Trump's ideas on Amtrak between now and congressional elections in 2026? When it comes to Amtrak, Trump does not think highly of it. On multiple occasions over his first administration, he proposed significant cuts to Amtrak, oftentimes cuts that would have endangered the future of long-distance Amtrak service. Which, if you ask me, was not a wise move politically, considering the fact that several swing states in 2016 and/or 2020 have long-distance Amtrak service. It doesn't take that many people mad at you for removing daily long-distance Amtrak service to lose a state, and therefore an election. Wise or not, though, Trump's actions on Amtrak during his first administration tell me that he might not feel charitable towards Amtrak in his second administration. And that attitude is likely not to be helped by who he nominated as his transportation secretary. He nominated former Congressman Sean Duffy to the position. The Rail Passengers Association noted that there were 14 times during his tenure in Congress when there were amendments deemed to target passenger rail, in the view of the organization. He took the anti-passenger rail position all 14 times. The actions of the first Trump administration, as well as the Duffy appointment for the second Trump administration, tell me that the incoming president likely won't be behind Amtrak. And because the president, the House, and the Senate will all be controlled by the same political party, the Republican Party, I guess this means Amtrak's situation is all doom and gloom for the next 2 years. Right? Wrong. One thing to understand about the political climate around Amtrak is that it does not split evenly along party lines, especially in areas where Amtrak is vital for a large number of constituents. It gets a lot of bipartisan support. In particular, there are 2 categories of Republicans who I expect to be among the strongest opponents to any proposed Amtrak budget cuts, if recent history tells us anything. The first category of Republican is those in states where long-distance service, funded with the help of the federal government, is vital to many of their constituents. For example, when there were service cuts to long-distance service during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, it drew the ire of politicians across the political spectrum, including Republican senators in states where daily long-distance service is vital for communities. Republican senators, such as Jerry Moran in Kansas and Steve Daines in Montana, were particularly vocal. Which makes sense, because both senators have long-distance Amtrak service in their states that is vital to many of their constituents. In Kansas, you have the Southwest Chief Service, and in Montana, you have the Empire Builder Service. Daines and Moran, along with Roger Wicker in Mississippi, were identified by the Rail Passengers Association as pro-Amtrak members of the Republican caucus. In a Senate Republican caucus that will have 53 members, all you need is these 3 senators plus one other Republican to join Democrats in opposing Amtrak cuts, and any cuts proposed by Trump would then be defeated in the United States Senate. However, there is a second category of Republican who will likely oppose any cuts to Amtrak funding proposed by Trump: Republicans in the northeastern United States. In the northeastern US, many people use Amtrak rather than drive or fly, and that includes people in the Northeast who have Republican representatives. That, perhaps, is why the people most key to defeating a proposed cut to Amtrak by Republicans in the House in 2023 was members of their own party who represent northeastern states. Between these two aforementioned categories of Republicans, I am cautiously optimistic that any proposed cuts to Amtrak will be defeated, just as proposed cuts to Amtrak were defeated the last time there was a President Trump, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate. I can only be cautious because I know Trump values loyalty. And since I know Trump values loyalty, I have no idea how these politicians would respond if one of his Amtrak budget proposals suddenly became a Trump loyalty litmus test. In such a situation, would they choose being loyal to Trump, even if it meant cutting the Amtrak service their constituents receive? Or would they choose their constituents first, even ahead of Trump? If these politicians are ever faced with such a choice, I would advise them to choose their constituents first. Trump will only be around in the White House the next few years, but any cuts to Amtrak service could be felt by constituents for decades beyond when Trump leaves office. Even so, I remain cautiously optimistic that Amtrak can avoid deep cuts in the next 2 years. Furthermore, I think that there can be opportunities for Amtrak to actually expand service, believe it or not. And yes, that's even with Trump in the White House. Here's how. Section 403B-C of the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970, which formed Amtrak, required Amtrak to provide service if a state, regional, or local agency demanded it and was willing to pay, quote, no less than 66 2/3 per centum of, nor more than, the solely related costs and associated capital costs, including interest on passenger equipment, less revenues attributable to such service. Translated into non-legislative English, no matter what is going on with Trump and however he feels about Amtrak, and no matter what is going on with Congress and Amtrak, there is an opportunity for Amtrak to expand, if a state or states would be willing to financially back said expansion. The state or states, of course, need to be willing, as well as have the money for it. But my point is that you don't need Trump's or even Congress's approval to add new routes funded predominantly by the states, also known as state-supported routes. Speaking of state-supported routes, I'm not convinced that they would be impacted greatly by an anti-Amtrak president, mostly because, as you can tell by the name, they are routes that are funded by states rather than by the federal government. As you can tell by now, I'm not as pessimistic as many about Amtrak's prospects under a second Trump administration. It's definitely unhelpful that the incoming administration will likely be less supportive of Amtrak than the outgoing one. And because of that, I think Amtrak advocates will need to put in some work to make sure the pro-Amtrak Republicans in the House and the Senate remain pro-Amtrak Republicans. But unless the pro-Amtrak Republicans in the House and the Senate decide to change their tune, I don't think we're in for some Amtrak apocalypse. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, though. Please leave your comments in the comment section below. Make sure also to leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you, and have a good day.